Okay, so good afternoon to everybody. Just before we start, I just wanted to acknowledge the colossal undertaking of you guys in the officiating family during the lockdown period, whether that's doing touch bases with your umpires, or if it's been doing quizzes to keep the officiating family and team white together and all engaged. Or if it's more supporting people through the roles of COVID officer and return to court now that we're actually moving towards that phase. You know, we need you more than ever. I know that you guys have come back to us to say that you're really appreciative of the levels of support that you've received from England Netball during this time, and certainly all of the work that's gone into those preparation documents to get you there has been something that we'd never experienced before. I often said that I'd never worked as hard as I ever did when I was in school as a deputy head teacher, but goodness me, these last 16, 17 weeks, it's been white knuckle rides and the nose to the grindstone. So just to give you a heads up of what we're going to cover today, we should be going on for about an hour. But of course, if anyone needs to leave during the session, by all means you can do. It is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. But we're going to look through the responsibilities of umpires throughout their journey, both from their house to the venue, onto court, looking at the modifications, post-match, your exit, and then there's an opportunity to have any questions answered at the end, depending on time. What I will say is that if you do have questions, just sit on them till we get to the Q&A. Myself and Ian won't have the ability to address questions in text during, and often we've found that these are covered in the presentation and are often answered. So with the greatest of respect, don't waste your time by asking a question during. You'll have an opportunity to have it answered. Now, as I say, if we run out of time, there'll be an extension of 5 minutes for anybody to put their questions in the chat at the end, but we will make sure, and we commit to, and I am a man of my word, answering every question there is. And believe it or not, there are no silly questions. So now today, as I said, we are only covering the modifications. Now, whilst coaches are very good at telling umpires what to do, umpires very rarely know very little about coaching. So if you've got questions about coaching, get onto one of the coaching forums. We're not the experts in it, and we wouldn't dream of passing on any information. And you can get those from England Netball coaching at englandnetball.co.uk. We won't be covering general rules inquiries either. You can submit those to officiating at englandnetball.co.uk. And any queries about the pathway, practical and written assessments, they need to go to qualifications at England Netball and will be dealt with by Education and Training. Now, I do know that Education and Training are currently working with Netball Europe to determine if we are able to use the modified version to begin the assessment process again, but we don't know what the outcome of that is at the moment. So rest assured, you'll know when we know, but work is going on in the background. So just before we start, I will just make this very, very clear. We know that there are some nervous people out there and some people that would break their necks to get back on court and everything in between. But rest assured, whichever camp you sit in, you should know that you're not to feel pressure to go back on court if you don't want to, okay? And as an aside to that, we will be here officiating at englandnetball.co.uk. We'll be here with you every step of the way. Now, your regional and regional and county umpiring secretaries are also part of your extended network, and they will be there to support you as well. So lots of support, ask questions, and make sure you get the answers that you need. So the modifications. I think when these first got released, people looked at the game and thought, it must be a little bit like bubble football. Well, that's the exact opposite of what it is. You know, we're going to show you what it really looks like, and the fact that, in actual fact, everybody doesn't need to make sure that they're 4 feet away from each other, like repelling magnets. You can't enter a 4-foot zone of an opponent and they can't do it for you. It absolutely looks like standard netball once you get going. Now, the misconceptions and the importance of asking questions to the right people is something that we've got really, really, really at the centre of our hearts. Now, we know the power of social media groups, but please remember that the best information always comes from the horse's mouth, and we'll happily answer any questions that you've got, and they come with fact and are exempt from opinions that you might find on different social media groups. So I am now going to hand over to my colleague.
So yeah, as Gary mentioned, just for me to provide a little bit of a brief background as to why the modifications that we have created have been created. First of all, we've been working to a government framework to assess and understand the risks of netball in relation to how COVID is spread. In standard netball, and by standard netball, I mean the traditional version that we were playing pre-lockdown, our sport has been deemed high risk due to the close contact and the face-to-face nature of the sport. Our modifications that we have issued have been approved by government as we have been able to demonstrate how we can reduce the risks of the game with these. You'll probably have seen in some news reports today that the government are likely to be tightening many areas across the country. However, as our modifications are part of a team sports framework, these will be exempt from these additional restrictions that will be announced to enable netball to continue with these modifications. In terms of the modifications themselves, they've specifically been designed to remove face-to-face interactions of less than 1 metre for longer than 3 seconds, which has been identified as high risk, and also face-to-face interactions of less than 1 metre for less than 3 seconds, which have been identified as medium risk. The modifications also reduce the number of interactions within 1 metre that are not face-to-face, so that could be side to side, front to back for longer than 3 seconds. These 2 medium risk areas have to be for less than 15 minutes in total. Any medium risk interactions that total greater than 15 minutes move our sport into the high risk category. The modifications are also designed to reduce idle interactions or periods of rest when players were stood within 1 metre of each other unnecessarily, as these technically don't impact the playing of the game in any way, but do present an additional risk of spreading the virus. Our other objectives for the modifications were really to try and stay as close to the standard format of the game as possible whilst mitigating risk. Our desire has been to keep the essence of the sport throughout all of this, and also to enhance the off-court safety and hygiene measures to support these on-court modifications as well. It is very important to note that as officials, you will play an important role in these modifications, but this is none more than any other group involved. Players and coaches have responsibility to avoid putting themselves and others at risk by following the modifications that are in place. It is everybody's responsibility during this time to follow all of the protocols in place. And with good compliance, there should be no issues, and everyone should be able to return to netball, which is what we are striving to achieve during this time. So I'm now going to talk through some of the pre-activity steps that as officials you will go through. So prior to activity starting, on the screen is a list of things that officials should do. And this is whether this is for a training session or a match. I would also like to note that all of this is included in the official section of the care package that you have access to on our website. So you will need to start off by reading the personal risk assessment. This is to understand the potential risks of netball and the specific groups that might be more vulnerable at this time. The risk to umpires is significantly lower than the players on court due to the requirement to be 4 feet away from players and things such as not touching the ball. But it is, however, important to note that it is not completely without risk. You will also need to read and confirm the opt-in statement. This is required to be part of any netball activity, and all officials need to understand and agree to this prior to becoming involved in activity. You will also need to use the symptom checker. Now, this can be done initially at home prior to umpiring and getting out of your house safely, but you'll then need to do it when you arrive at the venue to get yourself in. And you should also ask about any specific venue entry and exit requirements from the organizer. And this person should be able to give you all of this information. If they don't, you need to insist that this is important so that all that are attending are aware of the requirements that this may bring. On to the next slide. It's also important as an official that you know who the COVID officer or officers are for the session that you are attending. And this is especially important in the event of the development of any symptoms following netball activity. You should also, and some of these are common sense things, make sure that your equipment is cleaned prior to leaving home. We want you to arrive ready to officiate and in kit so that changing rooms shouldn't be used. The principle that we're working to during this phase is get in, play safe and get out. So arrive with all that you need and ensure that you are ready to go is vitally important. Any personal items that you are bringing should be clearly marked and not shared. So things such as water bottles, etc. And you should travel, to any netball activity on your own. We realise that this might not always be possible, and where it's not possible, there is government guidance on their website that provides the most accurate and up-to-date information about travel. And this includes measures at the minute, such as keeping windows open and wearing face masks if you are car sharing. So that's all of the prior to activity stuff. Now we're going to discuss what officials need to do when they arrive at a venue for activity. And I think the first thing to say is don't arrive excessively early. We obviously don't want people arriving late, but excessively early also isn't helpful during this time. Time on site should be minimised, and early arrivals may cause capacity limits if earlier activity is still continuing, and it unnecessarily puts you and others at risk by arriving so early as well. When you do arrive and go into the venue, you will need to register. There may be a registration desk or an area, and the organiser should give you details on where this will be. And as part of this registration process, you will be asked to verbally complete a health screening questionnaire to ensure that you are symptom-free when you arrive. You will also be asked to complete the test and trace protocol, which is likely to be the scanning of a QR code on your phone and completing the details that will then appear and pop up on your phone when you do this. This is for the test and trace protocols. Should you develop symptoms yourself or need to be contacted after the session to inform you that someone has tested positive for COVID that was at the activity? It might not be through a QR code. Organisers may put another system in place, but it is important that you do whatever test and trace protocols are in place. And this is no different to protocols that you may have already experienced if you do things such as go and visit a restaurant. In addition to this, there might be additional venue, club or league requirements that they require you to do when you arrive, and these should be followed, but these should be communicated to you in advance by the activity organiser. I'm now going to hand over to Gary, who's going to talk you through some of the pre-match checks.
Thanks, Ian. So just to myth bust before we start, we've got a lot of questions that come in from people saying, are umpires responsible for this? Are umpires responsible for that, etc., etc., and the list goes on. So I'm saying to you all now, really confidently, that you're not responsible for the health screening of individuals or any of the actual sanitation of balls or equipment yourself. Okay, you're only responsible for yourself. Getting in and out as safely as possible. Now that is all to do unless you have an additional role. So you might be a COVID officer, well that's a different role, it's not your role as an umpire. So when we're talking about the balls and the post protectors, now the balls have to be sanitised prior to the match and both teams have one ball each, okay? So they have to sanitise those before the match. Now, the team whose centre pass it is, they will use their ball and the second ball is used as reserve. Now, if such a thing should happen as the ball that you're using rolls away, perhaps is touched by somebody else or, you know, it just gets contaminated, the other ball is used and they're swapped over. The umpire will hold time, swap the ball over. Now, the team whose ball has been contaminated should have a nominated person to clean that ball. Okay, so at all times, there should be a ball that's clean being used and then also one that's ready to be replaced. Now, as I said, at every quarter time, the ball needs to be sanitised. Now with the post protectors, they only need to be sanitised at the beginning of play and then subsequently if anyone touches them. So in the scenario where the ball gets stuck in the ring or in the net, just a little tap with your foot or a wobble with your foot will free up the ball without the need to touch it with a hand. Now, if, for instance, there's a little bit of a tussle and another player bumps another player into the post, yes, contest in the circle is allowed in this version. The umpire would just hold time and the home team nominated person will just pop over, wipe down the post with a sanitising wipe, and then play will continue on the umpire's whistle. Okay? Now, with regards to nail checks, we highlighted that these were an increased risk measure that needed to be mitigated away. So those just need to be done from a social distance of 2 meters. Now it's very easy. We did trial this, even with my poor eyesight, that you can actually see nails and sharp adornments from 2 meters away. Anyone that doesn't believe me has probably seen the umpire. Now, the other thing that I would say, just after you've done your nail check, and what we're suggesting really is that nail checks potentially are done in a socially distanced circle, and you just kind of look, you know, kind of an open circle. You look at the nails from that point of view. Now, just at the end, what we would say to you is just give the players, because you're there to help them out as much as they're there to allow you to umpire, just give them a heads up and remind them of, make sure your ball's cleaned at quarter time, girls. Make sure there's no stepping in and you're following the modifications, and have a look for me because I'm going to be trying to help you as much as we can to stay the right side of the modifications. That very small statement will get players on side immediately and will plant a seed in their mind that they have to do certain things. Now that's the tip of umpiring that you could do during play, but for these modifications, it's something that we should do during the check. Now, the other things just to consider is bonkers really, but it's all to do with foamite transmission. The coin toss should be done by the home captain. They toss the coin, it drops to the floor, and then the opposition captain has a look at the coin, and then the home team captain picks the coin up and takes it away. So there's no exchanging of a foamite there unnecessarily. Now, bib sharing really isn't an umpire's problem. You don't have to worry about that at all. That's for the teams to worry about, but there's a whole long list of the alternatives to bib sharing on the care package. But for instance, they do involve situations where if it's one player that's changed, they turn the bib inside out and they might write with a face paint pen on their arms, or they might have removable patches with sticky Velcro that you can put on there. But have a look at all of the alternatives in there and just check with the teams in your nail check what alternative they are going to use. Okay, moving on, he says. So the game modifications we're going to look at today, we're going to look at the position of umpires and scorers, the forfeit spacing versus contest, what really is an idle interaction, many of you have asked, the forfeit spacing at the start of a play, position of the penalised players, the removal of toss-ups and what happens instead, intervals, social distancing, injury, illness and blood, the goal circles, and then game management as well. So let's cover this off. Umpire and scorer positioning. Now, a lot of people have asked that in venues where they've got narrow runoffs, what do you do to stay 4 feet away from the players? Now, you obviously can't go into the wall, so our advice is to position a little further down the court or a little further up the court. We're not too worried in the initial return about where people are standing with regards to if they can or cannot see. This is about game facilitation and getting everybody back on court and back into the swing of the things. That's the excuse I'm going to use when an assessor tells me I'm not in the right place. So you might want to stick that in your hat and use it when you need to. Now, likewise, on the goal line, you may also be in a situation where you probably don't go beyond the post because there'll be a concentration of players under the post and it might be difficult in a narrow runoff environment for you to get close to the post. So you might hang a little bit wider on the goal line, probably to just where the goal circle joins the goal line. That's probably a good place to take up a position. Now, with all of that in mind, if you've still got a court with a good runoff, you should still position as you normally do. These are only considerations to do in courts with short sidelines and goal lines. Now, if I think back to my glory days in the Bedford District Netball League, on a court with multiple courts, you will notice that we are advising, in netball we're advising that in this format, that if you can, the middle court should be left vacant. But ultimately, we know that a number of courts won't have that choice. It's a bit like the choice between, do you go indoor or do you go outdoor? If you can go outdoor, then go for it. But if you can't, obviously indoor is advisable. This is the same with this example here. So if you have to go across all three courts, what you need to consider is where the running paths of the umpires would be. Now, we as umpires would only ever cross paths with our co-umpire in these setups back to back, which provides the least risk in these situations. So there is very little risk in these situations. However, if we look at the first court on the left, if the umpire stays to their goal end of the centre circle and the other umpire stays to what we would call the north end, they do not cross paths at all. And there's an exclusion zone of about 4 to 5 feet, which is covered by the pink box on the diagram. Likewise, if you've got an end-to-end court, this is probably a better diagram to describe it. If you stay this side rather than the far side of the goal post, you will be able to avoid having to cross paths. But I will just say, if you are back to back, as you would be on court, if on court players are back to back or front to back on court, it provides very limited risk. So if you do brush bottoms with your co-umpire, just give them a smile and tell them to give you a little bit more space. All right. So with regards to scorers, at this stage in time, the requirement for a full technical table is not required at this stage. Now, if there's Premier League or Super League technical officials on here and Super League and Premier League umpires, you will be given additional opportunities to talk about the mitigations in place for those competitions. But where a scorer on a local league game or two scorers on a local league game, they will have to be adaptable to where the situation is because all of the variables are innumerous. So this gives you a reasonable idea of where they could and couldn't be. And we work on the basis, as long as the scorer can see, and as long as they're stood 2 meters apart from each other and 2 meters apart from anyone else, then they can stand where they can see. Okay? Now, moving on to contest and bubble netball. So as I said right at the beginning, have to avoid opposition at all cost. What we've tried to avoid is face-to-face contact or interactions within 1 meter. So that means these idle under the post, face-to-face, when you're nose-to-nose with a person with your arms in the air waiting for a rebound, we're trying to avoid those. We're also trying to avoid face-to-face interactions within 2 meters that are longer than 3 seconds. And the reason we're saying this is because if it's longer than 3 seconds, you absolutely could be breathing in each other's exhalation. Now that happens across the court in interactions and fleeting interactions, but the risk is so much lower because they happen for such a short period of time. So those are the things effectively we're saying that should be avoided at all cost. Now, what we can do and what netballers can do, they absolutely can run together side by side, even touching shoulders, run together to go and get a ball, take possession of the ball. The minute the player's got possession of the ball, like with the obstruction rule, they have to find their distance straight away. That is the same. They can defend front to back, and this is where my hands get a little bit funny because it is all a bit mirror image in my video. So you can go front to back, you can even touch front to back and move around and control and confuse space. You can contest for ball, but the key to all of this is to keep moving and avoid standing still close next to somebody. Now those aren't actually infringements in any rules. Modifications are not rules. They're actually just modifications. The rules remain the same. But as long as people are moving and not standing still, it's the responsibilities of the players to make sure they're doing it and the coaches supporting them to remind them to keep doing it. Now, as we've said earlier on, what really is an idle interaction? So an idle interaction normally happens when the ball is in the other area of court and players are not involved. So if we've got players on here at the moment, it will be the time when you kind of think to yourself, or if those of you that have played that are now umpiring, it's times when you actually think, well, I'm not really involved here. That's when it should trigger in your mind that you need to potentially be away from the person that you're either marking or you're standing next to. That's the kind of concept that we're looking for. It can happen when players are having a rest period. So when you're having a breather, you might be having that breather next to an opposition player. Often it's these two, goalkeeper and goal shooter. As I've said millions of times before, having a gossip. You can still have your gossip, but you just need to be 4 feet away. The minute you think that you're in with a chance of getting back involved in play, so perhaps in a defensive turnover, that's when you start moving again. So you position apart. The minute the play switches or a centre pass is taken, that's when you can start moving. They also happen after a goal scored. So everyone running back to the transverse line for the centre pass, although we'll touch on that in a moment. And then also at the end of a quarter, when everyone's walking back, crossing paths with each other, going back to their benches. Now, all of those interactions can happen quickly. You know, remember, a lot of the stuff that we do in netball is for 3 seconds or less than 3 seconds. But as long as you're moving past each other quickly, there is limited risk involved in it. They can occur, but you just need to make sure you're away from that player. Now, forfeit spacing and the start of play. Now, this diagram also caused a little bit of a misunderstanding, but what I will say is the diagram represents a snapshot in time if everyone decided to stand still at that precise moment in time and not move. If they did that, they would all have to be 4 feet away. But as we know, that very rarely happens in a netball match. That's why we all love it so much. Now, for the start of play, it will either be at the beginning of the match or quarter, or the restart of play after a goal is scored. So people running back, if you look at the goal attack and goal defence on the left, they actually might be running back to this centre pass side by side within 4 feet of each other. The whistle's blown fractionally before they get to the line and they carry on running. Now, that's absolutely fine. If a player decides to be stationary, they just need to make sure that they're 4 feet away from an opponent and no one's within inside their space. Now, we're going to look specifically at the goal shooter and the goalkeeper. Now, the goal shooter and the goalkeeper are required to start inside the circle, but this is not an infringement if they don't do it. It's a modification, and the umpires should remind them that they need to be inside the circle, but the goal shooter and the goalkeeper need to make the effort to ensure that they're inside. Now, if they're not, umpires should use quiet words. Now, if the ball is going towards the goal shooter, the umpire might just hold the centre pass fractionally and just say, goal shooter, goalkeeper, inside the circle, please. Likewise, if it's going to the right of the screen away from the two people involved, they may allow play to continue and just tell them that they need to remember next time. Now, subsequently, any reminders that you have to give to players can be reinforced with the coach and also the captain and any players at quarter time. But as I've said, and I will say continuously through this presentation, if the players do what they're supposed to be doing, it won't happen. Famous last words, I'm sure. Now, on the transverse line, as I said before, movement is the key. Okay, so those people don't actually have to stand in those positions. They don't actually have to stand up to the transverse line. They can be anywhere in the goal third. Now, goal attack, and goal defense could be quite close to each other as long as they are moving around. And those coaches that are on, you'll call that confusing space. So the umpires, I didn't actually know that before, but basically a player that keeps moving from side to side of an opponent is trying to confuse which side they're standing. So the player that's going to pass them the ball doesn't know which side they're going to pass to. So all of that movement around and interactions occur. They can be within 4 feet of each other because it poses less of a risk. Now, when we come to the centres, the same can be said to the centre. So it's very rare that a centre would choose to be in a static position anyway. They're the terriers of the court and they run around. So if they decide to be face-to-face, they need to do it from 4 feet away. But likewise, if they then decide to defend a centre pass against an opposition coming into it, they need to be 4 feet away from that player. So moving on then to of a penalised player. Now, this one's the easiest one to administer. We are still saying that penalised players should be beside and away, but they should be beside and 4 feet away. Now, in practice, as we all know, when you set a penalty or you expect a player to stand out for a penalty, the ball's often gone quicker than the time it takes to go. So we would envisage in this version of netball, when the player, the goal defence in this instance on screen, is moving away to get to position, the pass would have been given. And as we do know, the rules were changed in 2016 to say that the non-offending player does not need to wait for that player to gain in possession. If such a thing should happen, as the goal defence intercepts whilst they're running away, I don't know how that would happen, but just in case, then the penalty's reset and the player could well be cautioned under the actual 2020 rules of netball, not the modifications. But these things are often what-if scenarios, and the chances are they probably never will happen. But now I've said that, they probably will happen loads of times, but you're all covered now. So, we've all wanted this anyway, umpire, so we finally get our way. There's another thing that we've always wanted, and we've got that too, but I'll talk about that later on. So no toss-ups are permitted. They are face-to-face manufactured situations where we throw the umpire in for good measure so everyone breathes in each other's breath. Get rid of them straight away. However, what happens if you have a situation where a toss-up would have been awarded? So in the event that this happens, the team that had possession directly before the consideration for toss-up to be given retains the ball. Now we've got an example here, red centre pass. It's a simultaneous breaking and the red team that's called, the umpire would blow the whistle for simultaneous breaking. However, the free pass would be given back to the red team because they held possession directly before that situation. Likewise, the only other situations that we could think of was simultaneous out of court or other simultaneous actions. The blue team member passes the ball, a blue team player and red team player simultaneously knock the ball out or perhaps simultaneously go offside, etc., etc. All of those simultaneous actions, the blue team would be awarded that free pass on court, and it would be dealt with as any other free pass infringement. Now, any other situation, whatever you can think of, and I'm sure there will be one, if it's not covered in this example, then it resorts back to the team that took the last centre pass. So if it's a red centre pass and it gets down the court, then it goes back to that red centre pass. Those situations where umpires are not sure who had possession of the ball in a stoppage, that covers off all of those. The most fair way to do it is to maintain the team's centre pass possession so that no one's unduly penalised. One tip for umpires, you should always know, but there have been times that I've not known, so it's okay. Intervals and social distancing. So that's most of the gameplay stuff. What do you need to do during the interval? So when you get to the game, position your chairs, or listen, I know I'm a bit of a princess when it comes to what we get and what we don't get at my level of umpiring, and I know that sometimes it's just a corner where you chuck your bag. So position that away from everybody else, but also 2 meters away from your co-umpire, unless you live with them, okay, and you're in that bubble. So just 2 meters away. When the final whistle for a quarter is blown, just wait fractionally on your sideline away from the players. Let them get back to their safe areas and then you can go back to yours. Now on the diagram right at the very beginning, you'll see that the bench configurations are in the corners. Now that is a recommendation of where the benches should sit, should be, and that's the safest position. So the traditional side-by-side benches next to a score table or whatever, it's not good because everyone's in the same place. Now, again, just on that situation, just as you walk past, just say to the players, give them a heads up from 2 meters away, make sure you clean your ball. Okay, it's all of those sorts of things that will actually support that, making sure it's happened by the time you get back on. Now, at the end of the interval, you return back to your chair, sit socially distanced, as I said, and a few moments before you blow the 30-second whistle, make sure you sanitize your hands. It will be very easy to forget it, but this is just an additional safety measure, just in general, okay? As you blow the 30-second whistle, just whip back to your part of the court so you're there before the teams leave their benches. Now, the team should stay on their team bench. We know that teams like to go back, early doors, eager beavers, but they need to stay there until the 30-second whistle. Okay? Now, injury and illness and blood. Now, as I've said already today, all of these situations that occur, the modifications aren't actually rules, they're guidance, okay? The 3 foot increase into 4 foot is a rule. That's the only one really that we're covering in. But when it comes to injury, illness or blood, the standard injury rules apply. However, do not be afraid to extend the injury time if you think the safety of the injured player is at risk. Now, that's the same as the normal rules at the moment. You can extend it for an emergency. Don't worry about things like that. Just the common sense aspect will prevail. Now, obviously, you should stay on your sideline. There's no need for you to walk over to an injured player. That's the same in standard netball. But if the player is on the ground, just make sure that the person that's with them, and again, they should have a primary carer, just make sure they just give the floor a wipe and that they've got the means to make sure that's dry. Don't go over there and touch it with your hand to check it's dry. You can see from where a good proximity away from to see actually if it is dry. Okay, and then you restart the game as normal. Now, we move on to the most contentious of issues, the goal circles. Now, one of the biggest things that people have thought is that there is no contest in modified netball, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Now, I'm going to hopefully give you an example of what confusing space means. So if coaches are out there, you absolutely know what this. I'm an umpire. I really didn't know until Colette Thompson told me. So confusing space is basically a player continually moving around another player to confuse the goal shooter on whether or not she can pass to her. Now, what I would say in that situation is that can happen across anywhere. So before we move into the goal circle, it will probably be happening on the circle edge. As long as they're moving, you won't have to do anything about them on the circle edge. Now, your co-umpire will be able to support you on this, and they could just say, in this example, to wing attack, wing defense, if they were too close, wing attack, wing defense, 4 feet, please. Big smile. Oh yeah, umpire, we forgot, we're really into it. So that sort of thing will address those sorts of forgetful behaviours. Now, I'm just going to whiz through some of these setups in the circle and show you setups for rebounds and setups for play. Now, these are diagrams, and you'll have to believe me that the players are 4 feet away. So in this diagram here, you can see that the goal attack and the goal shooter are within 4 feet of each other. However, they're side to side, which prevents a medium risk. Okay, so they're not a concern at this precise moment in time. The goalkeeper is defending from 4 feet away, therefore there's no risk there. And also the goal defence is positioned within 4 feet of the goalkeeper. However, the goal defence is front to back on the goalkeeper. If you hadn't clocked already, whoever designed these avatars has put little buns on the back so you know which is the front and which is the back of people's faces. And you can tell the umpire's not me for the obvious reasons. Okay. So on this example, goal attack and goal defence are 4 feet away. The goal shooter is within proximity of 4 feet of the goal defence and the goalkeeper, but she's facing away back to front to back to the goal defence, and the goalkeeper behind her is front to back in those situations. Okay. Now moving again, the goal attack and goal defence are 4 feet away. The goalkeeper is side to side with the goal defence facing forward, and the goal shooter is behind the goalkeeper in a rebound position. Hopefully you're getting the gist of actually, oh, what on earth are the goalkeeper goal defence going to be allowed to do? Well, actually they can pretty much do everything they used to do, and also the goal shooter and the goal attack can do the same. We're just trying to avoid face to face. Now, I'll just skip on to these ones. Now, in this situation here, you often get that pesky goal attack deciding to position closely to the shooter. I don't really know why they do it, but they do it for a reason. That really is not allowed. Okay, now we'll go on to what you do about it in a moment. However, the goal attack and goal shooter are within 4 feet and are facing each other. Now, that may well happen on a spin round. So, for instance, if you go back to front, you spin round and roll a player, there may be a fractional situation where you are face to face for a very minute situation. Now that is not a problem because that will happen, and we cannot get rid of every single thing in the game. But all of this actually is down to the player's responsibility. None of this at this precise moment in time is to do with you umpiring and your interpretation of the situation, as long as the defenders are not defending within 4 feet, because hey presto, that will be obstruction and is very easy to penalise. Okay, so in this situation it's the same one. The goalkeeper has turned her back on the shooter, which ordinarily would be okay. However, she's face to face now with the goal defence. The goal attack is front to back with the goal defence, so that bit's all right. Now, if, for instance, the goalkeeper was distanced, decided to turn round and then realised the goal defence was then face to face, they'd probably go, I'm face to face, and move again. So it's just having a look at those sorts of situations, okay? It's the responsibility of the player to realise that. Now, here we go, on to the most asked question with the most obvious answer, okay? Can a goal shooter step in to reduce the distance between her and a goalkeeper? The answer to that question is no, she shouldn't, okay? Now, on the coaching and on the player education forums, players and coaches are going to be told not to do it. Coaches not to coach it, players are going to be told not to do it. You're going to give the heads up to the players in your pre-match briefing to say, oh, just remember, no face-to-face because it's really risky for you and anybody else on the court. And that answers that question completely. However, what happens if it does happen? The chances are that it might happen by accident because players have got habits. We've got some fantastic netballers that have been playing this game for at least 50, 60 years, okay? If they're in a habit of doing it, what you would do is you would blow the whistle immediately and say to the goal shooter, you need to step back. The goal shooter will then step back and then play will continue with the goal shooter in possession of the ball. Now, if that does happen, the advice would be to go back to the coach and the captain, request to speak to them at quarter time to just reinforce, hey, listen, we all knew that we shouldn't be stepping in and we knew that we shouldn't be risking the modifications or everybody in England's chances of being on court, okay? So having said all of that, if players and coaches actually follow the guidance and follow their responsibilities, it shouldn't happen. But just in case it does, you now know what to do with it. Now, there may well be situations where you as an umpire are convinced that players are doing things deliberately. Now, I always work on the basis if I've told players a couple or 3 or 4 times, no real inordinate time, but if I'm very clear that I'm supporting players to change their behaviour and they still don't, then that's when you can use game management. But when we're all back on court, we've not been here for 16 weeks. So everyone's been itching to get back on court. So we all want to have a great time. So now umpires, it's not about game management. It's about managing the game. So you need to support the players to change their behaviour. Now you can do it really easily by saying to goalkeeper, goal shooter, goalkeeper, goal shooter, 4 feet, come on. Now, if they're really, really excited, and it might be the case that that happens with more junior players, you might need to just drop a whistle in there. No turnover of possession, no penalties involved, but you just hold time to save time and to increase the safety of the game. Okay, don't worry about that. No one's going to pick you up on it. No one's going to ask why you did it. But actually, if the message is not getting through, then stop the game to pass on the message. Likewise, as I've already said, go and have a look with the coaches and captains at quarter time and ask them to support you. They should be doing it throughout the game anyway. This brings me on nicely to players and coaches needing to take responsibility to change behaviour and adhere to the modifications. You should manage the game with frequent quiet words to support players to change their behaviour, and as we've already said, captains and coaches at quarter time if required. Now, with any rule, modifications or not, persistent or deliberate infringements that risk the health of other players should be dealt with quickly, but should not occur if they take responsibility. Now, it doesn't happen in standard netball, but if I give you the example of if someone spits either on the floor at another player, then that to me would be an order off in modified netball or in standard netball. I've never done it in 20 years and probably 2,500 matches, so it probably won't happen now. But anything that's a complete and utter flagrant disregards for the rules would be dealt with absolutely in the same way. Now, you may escalate infringements more quickly than you normally would do to add to the safety of the player. But this is all about your instinct and dealing with each situation. I will reiterate, and I'm sure again the coaches will do the same, that if these situations occur, then the players need to take responsibility to avoid them. If we all do our part, they won't occur. Now, that's all of the modifications. Just before we move on, the business of excessive shouting. I was asked in the rules update what constituted mild foul language, and that was a very difficult conversation, but nearly as difficult as what is excessive shouting. Now, we know that umpires are going to give commands. We know that players are going to direct their players. It's not about a loud yeah or a loud right. It's about this stuff, and this goes back to what I said about toss-ups. How annoying umpires is it to have that player that goes right, 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 left, 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 up, down, 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 near, 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 side, side, side. That's excessive, and that's what we need to stop. Okay, so if a player does that, the queens of this would always just go, wing defence, thank you. That's how easy it is to diffuse those situations. If it's a bit tougher, ask the coach or the captain for some help, but you should be able to diffuse those situations with a one or two worder with a bit of a smile. Okay, so that's all of our modifications. What do you do post-match? So your final whistle goes, and basically what you need to do is wait on your sideline like you did for during play. Sign any paperwork with your own pen. However, if possible, this could be avoided. Now, scorers, it's your score pad. You can take it home because only you've touched it. Okay. If it needs to be photographed to be given to anybody else, then by all means, arrange that with the match organisers. You need to collect all your personal items and prepare for a prompt exit of the court. Okay. So that's where the umpiring section ends, and I can hand back to Ian Holloway.
Thank you, Gary. Make it sound so simple, but there are a few protocols to follow. So as officials, in terms of exiting the venue, as per arriving at the venue, you need to follow any venue-specific exit requirements and any traffic flows that are in place. Again, like entering the venue, this should be known in advance, and the organisers should be reminding you prior to your departure. In terms of umpiring multiple matches, this is permitted, but we want each match to be considered as a separate session. So this will mean that you will need to sign out and back in again if you are staying at the same venue. And this is due to working in an environment with different players. It will also mean that your records will be included across both environments for test and trace, which is essential for ensuring that if you are contacted, should a COVID case be prevalent, we know who you have been involved with as part of that session. So don't just remain courtside and wait for the next one. You almost need to exit and then come back and be part of that separate test and trace mechanism as well. In terms of playing and umpiring, this is permitted. We do have limits on the amount that a player can play. And those limits are, they can only play in one game and for no more than 60 minutes in a day. But you can both play and umpire in a day, and this is due to the lower risk connected to umpiring. As we said, on arrival, do not use the changing facilities when exiting. To go back to that principle, we're working on get in, play safe, and get out. So as soon as you are finished with your session or your activity, please promptly leave the venue without getting changed on site. And then as part of basic hygiene, all officials, alongside with players, coaches, and all other groups, must sanitize their hands as they leave. Finally, in terms of leaving, should you develop symptoms, you must notify the NHS test and trace protocols, and you should follow these protocols at all times. So this will involve self-isolating during this time and also informing the COVID officer of the netball activity if you do test positive as well. That's everything in terms of getting out of a venue once your officiating has finished. I'm now going to hand back over to Gary in terms of Q&A.
Thanks, Ian. Thank you to all of you on here. Now, as you will probably imagine, There are about 500 of you on this call or that were registered. And to take all of your questions at the moment would be a nightmare, but we're going to try and do it. Now, as I said right at the very beginning, if you put a question in the chat during the presentation, we won't be able to get back to it because we can't now scroll back through those effectively and ensure that everyone's question is answered. However, we are committed to answering every single question that comes in. Remember, there's no silly questions at all. Now, what's going to happen now is if you have got a question, we've got 10 minutes before the end of this session, and the session will be extended for 5 minutes for people just to write down any other questions that aren't answered. So I'm going to hand back to Ian, who, so if you have got a question, put it in the chat now, and Ian will read these out now. We'll do this for about 10 minutes, and we'll be able to answer as many questions as we can. I will just start off with a question that I just just popped up and I glanced at. A question was asked, are we still penalising if players are within 4 feet defending? Yes, you are. That's obstruction. So those rules, don't forget about those. A player that's defending within 4 feet, remember, is obstructing. The step in and asking a player to step back doesn't actually infringe the obstruction rule. It infringes a modification. So obstruction, all other rules stay the same. You're just trying to manage the situation with the modifications. Ian, what have we got next?
Okay, Gary, so we're getting a few in about how the ball should be returned. So normally the player would return the ball to the umpire and then the umpire returns it to the officials bench. Our umpire is not allowed to touch the ball at all.
Yep, so that's great. Umpires do not need to touch the ball. So each team is responsible for their own ball. So let's say, for instance, it's your centre pass and you enter onto court with your ball. You take that back and you are responsible for cleaning it. Now, if the ball is swapped, you just need to make sure the right team who owns that ball get it back to clean it during the match. You don't need to check that. That's a player's responsibility. They're the ones touching it, so they need to ensure that they have cleaned it adequately. You just need to check that it is cleaned just as you go back to your sideline. Make sure the ball's clean, girls. All good.
At centre pass, if a goal attack is standing still, can goal defence move around them within 4 feet?
Yep, that's fine. So as long as players are moving, that's fine. So again, the goal attack in this example is stationary. However, the player that's defending her is moving. So there is no issue there at all in that scenario.
Here, another one, just for clarification, the 4 foot is from the landing foot and not the nearest foot if a player steps in to throw the ball without lifting the landing foot.
Yeah, so this is really good. A shameless plug. We've got some really fantastic rules content that myself and Cheryl Danson, the chair of the International Rules Panel, did. And there is a very short video on Officiating Facebook that explains exactly what happens with the nearer part, the defending distance being taken from the nearer part of the nearer foot or feet of the defender. So have a look at that video and it will tell you exactly what you need to know.
There's a few coming in around the playing and umpiring on a day, Gary. Should I just very quickly go over just the principles around that? Are you happy for me to do that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So from a playing perspective, just to recap, the conditions that are set around playing are that a player can play in 1 game a day and for a maximum duration of 60 minutes. Now, the philosophy around that is that the modifications that we have provided are based on a 60-minute game being played. So 60 minutes is the maximum duration that an individual can play. That is because those medium risk interactions can't ever escalate above 15 minutes. And the analysis that we've conducted on the game are based on 60-minute games. And we can confidently say that from the sample sizes that we've identified, these modifications keep that risk below 15 minutes worth of those interactions. In terms of playing multiple games, we are saying no to that because during those interactions and the playing of a game, there may be instances when people are within 1 meter of each other. So therefore, the risk is still prevalent. And therefore, by mixing those environments from an individual playing against one team and then another team and then another team, you're expanding the risk of spreading the virus should that be prevalent. So that is why we're saying 1 game on 1 day for a player. From an umpiring perspective, because they should be keeping that distance of 4 feet, the risk is less. So ultimately, Umpires can umpire in multiple games within a day. If somebody wants to play and also umpire, they can only play in one game, but obviously they are free to umpire on multiple games. So hopefully that provides some clarity on that one.
Yeah. Just to jump in there, Ian, England Netball will always recommend, and a recommendation is you can choose to follow if you wish, but we always recommend only umpiring 2 games a day anyway, just to maintain mental sharpness and give the teams what they deserve. But it's entirely up to you, really. But as Ian said, there's no extended risk with regards to transmission of the virus, umpiring multiple games.
Yep. So just back into this, we have a question. Why do players that are static at centre pass have to be 4 feet away from each other, even if they are standing side by side? As stated earlier, you are allowing to stand side by side in the shooting circle.
Yep. So we aren't. It's not necessarily static. I think it might have been a confusion in the delivery there. So they're allowed to be static from 4 feet away. That was what we said. But with regards to the goal circle, again, they can all be static, be stood 4 feet away. It might end up that they're all in a square, a 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet square. But yeah, any part of the court, all players can be within 4 feet of an opponent or a teammate as long as they're moving.
If a goal attack takes a shot at goal, can the other 3 players stand under the post together waiting for a potential rebound?
Well, they can, but as outlined in the diagrams and also in the commentary in the presentation, they can't be static. They can't be face to face. So moving around, they might be back to back, or they might be side to side, but they need to keep moving and repositioning. So if you're watching this on a catch up, if you just rewind back to the section on inside the goal circle, it's clarified and re-clarified in that section.
We've had one around the COVID officer. How many COVID officers does a club have to have? I can pick that one up. That the club has to have a minimum of 1 or a lead of 1. If they decide to have additional people responsible for that or supporting with that, that's okay. And a question of if they are required to attend all matches. No, they don't. The COVID officer doesn't have to be in attendance at all matches, but they do need to ensure that whoever is actually involved in those matches are aware of any protocols that are in place. So
yeah, I think that's a good point to raise there, Ian, that actually when you're asked umpires to come and umpire a game, all of this pre-match information should normally be given to you in the email or the telephone call. It normally happens when you're given directions to get to a court or the start time of a match. For those people that are organising the game, just drop the name of the COVID officer in that text or in that WhatsApp chat or in that email, and also just let the person know if there's a specific entry and exit policy within the building that you're umpiring. I think we can all sit here and imagine where we're going to be going to umpire. Katie, what have we got?
So Gary, I'm going to throw the officiating specific ones over to you and I can pick up the risk mitigation ones. A great question from Samantha Kennison. GA is idle, GD is constantly on the move around the idle GA, never facing the goal attack. Can the goal defence be closer? Yep.
They absolutely can, because technically, just because the goal attack stood still, she's only idle if she's not involved in play. So what the goal defence is doing there is actually doing the right thing to avoid having to stand 4 feet away. So if the GD did stop, she'd need to be 4 feet away. But what she's actually doing is she's quite sensibly confusing the space so she can be within 4 feet of her opponent. She just needs to keep moving. Hey, so could you pick up Katie's question answering? I think if I just finish off what Katie's saying, we don't want to get into a situation of having to police anything. So someone did ask, you know, with regards to the rules, how do we police this? You're not there to police, you're there to apply and to support. When it gets to policing, it moves into a little bit more of an officious nature, and that's what we want to try to avoid at all cost. What have we got then, Sho?
I'm just checking I want on mute. Gary, you know that one. Just Stacey Boxall just saying, can you just reconfirm, could you go back to what to do if goal attack stands between goalkeeper, goal shooter as the goalkeeper is taking a shot, as if to block that defender?
Yeah, so one thing that we're asked again and again is blocking allowed? Face-to-face blocking, absolutely not. So if that goal attack is positioned in there, she will probably realise the minute, or she should realise the minute that she's nose to nose with an opponent, that she has to move. Okay, now if she doesn't move, that situation needs to be dealt with by the umpire, just like we would do on the step in. Just blow the whistle and just say to goal attack, or whoever was in that situation first, you need to move. Okay, immediately it should scatter the situation, but if everyone does what they're supposed to do, it probably won't happen very often at all.
Just scrolling down. So for you, Gary, next one from Lacey. Are we enforcing these rules for juniors / B netball, as well as social distance advice is different as they are in school bubbles and that kind of thing? So yeah. Are the rules all the way down?
Yeah, so the advice that we are giving to everybody is generic. So anybody that plays netball, all of the other versions of netball are to be played to the modified rules. Now, for those of you that are walking netballers, obviously there's a delay on that. The government want us to do some more work on that because of the high risk categories associated with walking netball. But if effectively everyone needs to play modified netball, even in school bubble situations, because that's our guidance. Schools can do as they wish. However, that's the advice from England Netball. And what I will say, if there are any teachers on the call, we have released our up-to-date schools guidance. So if you're a member but you're not a schools member, you can access that by contacting England Netball and getting your school some membership. I don't think it's I think for primary school it's free, secondary it's a nominal amount for a school budget. I know that because I used to hold one.
Sorry, so there's so many, I'm just trying to go through. Sam Inman asked, just as a question about, do we need to clean the post and stop the game? Like, do we really need to do that, or can we wait till quarter time when they're sharing the ball?
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, because the risk is there. If for instance, with tapping it with the foot to wobble the ball out of the net, it's absolutely fine. But if you think about the situations where, you know, a player might get all sweaty and white, you know, bump into the post and transfer sweat on there, it absolutely has to be moved off at that time because somebody else might do it. And there's the fomite transmission there. It's a bit like the situations with blood. You know, if you're bleeding, you've got blood on your dress and it's not your blood, you still have to come off and have your dress cleaned because of the safety associated with that. So yeah, you do still need to do it.
Beth Townsend asked, no stepping in from a shooter, but what about a split landing? Is that allowed?
Yep. So split landings are fine because they're covered by the footwork rule. And remember, there's been some adaptations to the footwork rule. So on a split landing, the nearer part of the nearer foot. So the player judges that when the player actually splits, pivots round to face a direction, then the defender has to find their distance of 3 feet from the nearer part of the nearer foot of their foot and the other person's foot. That sounds really, really hard to explain, but guess what? There's a fantastic video on this that you can have a look at on the Officiating Facebook page.
Okay. Francis Smith asks, how much space do you need between two courts to keep umpire and bench safe if at a central venue with 3 courts side by side?
So the guidance is a 2-meter runoff anyway between courts for competition regulations, and those have been in place for years and years. So there should always be 2 meters between sideline and sideline of adjacent courts. Now, when I created the diagrams of the courts on the presentation a little bit earlier on, it was with that in mind. So an umpire can actually function within a meter on the sideline. But like with everything, we know that in some of the school venues that aren't competition venues and some local league joint venues, that might actually be more narrow than 2 meters. So if I give you the example, at Superleague, it has to be 3 meters. At Premier League, it has to be 2 and a bit meters. But on local league, it's a guidance. So what I would say is, because it's so varied across the country, use common sense. Ask your COVID officer for support if you need to make a decision on that. But as an umpire turning up to a match, you shouldn't really need to have thought about that. It should have been done for you.
Gary, we're still getting a couple of questions around the starting position of a goalkeeper, goal shooter. So
Yeah.
as you referred to, that's the diagram. They start in the circle. People are
Yeah.
still asking, is that where they need to start, or can they start outside the circle?
No, they absolutely have to start inside of the circle. And the reason we did that was to avoid congestion on the transverse line, because the transverse line's only so big, and allowing 4 people at there, or sorry, allowing the 6 that could all go up to the transverse line would just make it a little bit more unmanageable. So yes, they absolutely have to start inside the goal circle. They can be very close together if 1 or 2 of them are moving.
I think I can answer this one. Let's go. Here's my limelight. So there's 2 scenarios. People are saying if 2 people become idle on the circle edge, whose responsibility is it? And then likewise, we've had if a goal shooter, goal attacker face-to-face in a scenario, who moves? So I guess my answer would be it's both responsibility. They both need to move. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely right. And this is what we would ask you, Shona, as a coach to coach. This is about a little bit of give and take. I mean, ultimately, we could have all been sat at home until the 12th of Never, waiting for social distancing to be removed. But actually, the government signed us off to go back to play with some of these things. So actually, opposite players from opposition teams, it's a little bit of give and take. Same teams, a little bit more common sense, but it all comes down to the players and coaches supporting them, taking responsibility. So that sounds like a really good opportunity to pause there. And just again, I just want to end with a massive vote of thanks to you guys. You know, we don't ever want to be in a situation where umpires and officials say, well, without us, you can't play, because the coaches and the players could also say that back to us. This is about a team effort, and for all of us getting our fantastic game back on court so we can get back to doing what we love. If you need any support, county and regional umpire secretaries are outstanding in what they do. So are we. We're a bit all right as well. So feel free to send in any questions to officiating@englandnetball.co.uk. And we will make sure that we leave the chat open now for you to just type in any more questions, and we will supply a list of answered questions after the forum this evening. Thanks very much, everybody, and I hopefully look forward to seeing you all on court very soon. Thank you.